If you understand that science cannot settle metaphysical questions, then what criteria do you have to judge which metaphysical hypothesis is superior? The criteria are different, and they are, and I will enumerate them to you: internal logical consistency, empirical adequacy. In other words, empiricism cannot positively settle the question, but your metaphysical theory cannot contradict observations. Otherwise, it's just wrong. So, internal logical consistency, empirical adequacy, coherence is important. And coherence has to do not with the internal logical consistency of your theory, but how it coheres with everything else we do know. And there is this other great guiding principle, which is conceptual parsimony. Now, I will grant to you that there is nothing etched in stone saying that nature has to be the simplest version of itself. It's not etched in stone. It's a subjective value. But I would argue to you that if we ignore this value, we are off to the races. We will be in a madhouse in no time. Because you see, everything can have countless more complex explanations. If you wake up in the morning and you see footprints in your backyard, I'll mention two possible explanations for that. One, a burglar tried to invade your house, didn't succeed, went away and left the footprints behind. That's explanation A. Explanation B, aliens from the Pleiades came through hyperspace, landed in your neighbor's backyard, stole your neighbor's shoes, jumped over the fence and went for a stroll in your backyard, then jumped back, put your neighbor's shoes back where they were, boarded their spaceship, and went back to the Pleiades. The second explanation, explanation B, accounts for the observations just as well as the first. Just as well as the first. Why do you choose A instead of B? Because B is more conceptually parsimonious. It requires less assumptions. You see,
this sounds like an argument for the functionalism of having a small amount of assumptions, but not as to the ontological validity of it.
Correct. I'll admit that, yeah. But I'll admit to that while emphasizing how important it is. If we don't hold to conceptual parsimony as a value for identifying the best metaphysical options, forget science. Those questions are settled by experiment. We are talking about being here, about metaphysics. If we ignore conceptual parsimony, we have to embrace the flying spaghetti monster. And I don't mean this metaphorically, I mean this literally. Because the flying spaghetti monster theory accounts for all facts just as well as quantum field theory and relativity. You can always explain all facts by saying that the invisible noodly appendages of the flying spaghetti monster is orchestrating everything the way it is. So, yes, it's an epistemic and subjective criterion. I admit to that. There's nothing objective etched in stone in nature saying that nature has to be the simplest version of itself. So I admit to that. But with one hand, I admit to that. With the other hand, I highlight to you how indispensable this subjective criterion is. Because the alternative is madness. It's complete nonsense.
Okay.
It's the flying spaghetti monster being taken very seriously.
Bernardo, I love you. I feel like we're at a oneness. I feel like your theory may be true because I'm here in tune with you right now. But I don't see your theory as being much more different than the flying spaghetti monster. Because you're saying, I don't mean that as insulting at all. Please. I'll admit that I know so little that I wouldn't even identify as being agnostic. I'm so agnostic that I'm not even agnostic. But I don't.
I know very little too.
Right. Okay, so how is your theory much different than someone saying that, well, that's just the way it is because God made it that way? And why can't one just say that? That seems like it's actually even more simpler. What's even more simpler, by the way, solipsism. So I'm wondering, why don't you just choose that? I do have my own ideas as to why you don't, but we can talk about that after.
I wrote about that. Look, I am a naturalist. A complete naturalist. I think things behave the way they behave because nature is what it is. And we can reduce things. We can reduce the human organism down to organs, and organs down to tissues, and tissues down to cells, and cells to molecules, and molecules to atoms, and atoms to subatomic particles, and those to quantum fields. So I grant all that. I'm a naturalist. I'm not saying that things happen the way they are simply because they are what they are. This is an expression of those who deny reductionism. I don't deny reductionism. I am an extreme reductionist. I want to reduce everything to one.
Right.
I'm an extreme form of a reductionist and an extreme form of a naturalist, because I say what is happening is because nature is what it is, and it can all be reduced to that one thing that nature is. The thing is, whatever position you have as a reductionist, at the end, you come to something that is not further reducible. You cannot explain one thing in terms of another forever. You have to come to at least one, you have to come to something that is reducible at the end, but in terms of which you can explain everything else. Philosophers call this your reduction set, your reduction base.
When you say reduction base, that's the same as math. It's the axioms.
Yeah, it's correlate with that. Yeah, the axioms are the reduction base of a mathematical theory. Yeah, but I mean that in an ontological sense, not in a modeling sense.
Okay.
So all reductionists will have to have a reduction base with at least one element, because the alternative to that is circularity. And nobody seriously proposing circularity.
See, that's what okay, we could talk about that after. There are some people, I'm sure you get emails of some people saying somehow we can bootstrap ourselves from nothing. Now there are some people who say even quantum fluctuations, but that requires...
You need at least potentials.
Yes.
You cannot pull something out of nothing. There has to be at least potentials. So they are defining existence in a subtly different and more restrictive way. But
yes,
okay,
I understand.
To go back to the point, every reductionist needs a reduction with at least one element. So why do I think my theory is more parsimonious? Well, let's compare to the competition. Let's see what else is on the table out there. If you are a naive materialist, the competition is a reduction base that contains every element in the menu of fundamental particles of our best model of microscopic nature we have today. And there is a menu of several particles, several fermions, the bosons. There are several particles. It's over a dozen. So if you're a naive materialist, that's your reduction base. Those things exist because they just exist. And they have no relation to each other. And they are what they are simply because they are what they are. That's it. You end there. Okay, that I submit to you that that's less parsimonious than reducing everything to one natural consciousness. Now, let's look at the more sophisticated, less naive competition. Let's look at the quantum field theorists. They reduce those particles to the corresponding fields. So different electrons are not really separate. They are not all in your reduction base. They are just patterns of vibration of one field for all electrons. Okay, that's a huge step forward. Now, instead of a reduction base with gazillions of elements, now we have only a handful. One field for each type of fundamental subatomic particle. But it is still several elements in your reduction base. So I'm more parsimonious than that. So is there more sophisticated competition? Well, there is the string theorists of the unified field quantum theorists, or the loop quantum gravity folks,
right,
or the M theorists, and they reduce those fields, and they try to reduce those fields to one, but then they fail to explain consciousness. Because the trick of a reduction base is not only that it has to be as small as possible, but you have to explain everything in terms of it. That's the criterion. You can have a reduction base with only one arbitrary element by saying, well, I explain one thing with this one arbitrary element, but I fail to explain everything else. Well, that's not fair. That's not how the game's played. So you have to put as few elements in there, but you still have to explain everything else in terms of them. I submit to you that the M theorists and unified quantum field theorists, they fail to do that unless they say that their quantum fields is just a model for consciousness. And then you can reduce everything to that. So my claim to having a parsimonious theory of nature, a philosophical one, not a scientific one, is based on the fact that I believe, and that's the case I have been putting forward for years in a variety of books and articles, scientific and otherwise, technical and otherwise, I believe I can argue that I can reduce everything to one field of consciousness, if you will, one instinctive, natural consciousness that underlies all reality. If I can do that, then I think it's an objective fact that my theory is the most parsimonious. It may not be the right one, but of those on the table, it's definitely the most parsimonious.
Have you heard of Ken Wilber?
I have heard of him, an integral theory, and I know nothing about it.
Okay, so how about, where do you disagree with Schopenhauer? I know he's you're standing on the shoulders of him, and you grant him plenty of status, but I'm curious, given that you know, something I don't like about watching philosophers debate, is, you're somewhat characteristic of this as well, is they'll reference Schopenhauer and then certain ancient text. You don't do this all the time, but I don't like that, because it's as if Schopenhauer is interpretable, but it's not as if there's a consensus on that. And it's not as if there's a consensus as to what the ancient texts mean. So when people appeal to them, I'm thinking the ideas have to stand on their own now. You can always say, it's just something funny about Nietzsche, is that Nietzsche philosophized with the hammer, famously. And when you read it, it's like someone with a megaphone speaking from a one-way mirror. And then you can't speak back to him. So what do you mean when you said that there's no such thing as facts? Well, then you're just left with, well, he said there's no such thing as facts, and he said it so emphatically. Okay, let me interpret. That's interesting. But you can't actually converse with them. So either way, that's just a little rant. When you talk about Schopenhauer, can you compare and contrast? You've studied Schopenhauer probably more than anyone else that I know, or maybe anyone else on the planet. So where do you agree and disagree with him on?
Can I comment just briefly
Yes,
on
please,
your preface to the question? I don't think it's fair to compare Nietzsche to Schopenhauer in that sense, because Nietzsche, although you can discern his meanings to exclude at least the most outrageous interpretations of him, like the Nazi interpretation of Nietzsche is outrageous. He said the contrary of what Nietzsche was not a nationalist. He was an anti-nationalist. He was the first European. He called himself the first European. He didn't care about national boundaries. He cared about culture, and he was very critical of German culture. So his co-opting by the Nazis was just outrageous,
Right.
One of the greatest offenses in the history of philosophy. But he wrote in a gnomic way, because his eyesight was so poor, he couldn't write real books. His only real complete book was The Birth of Tragedy, which was the first. Everything else was a collection of extended aphorisms. In the genealogy of morals, he tried to write 3 or 4 more complete essays, but they are essays. Even the genealogy of morals is not really a complete book. His only book was the first. So he couldn't see. He couldn't write properly. So he couldn't really spend a lot of time elaborating on his ideas. He had to make brief notes, and he published those notes in the form of aphorisms. The Gay Science, or because these words have been co-opted today,
Right.
The Joyful Wisdom, his book, is a collection of aphorisms, and so is Human Out to Human. It's a collection of aphorisms. So it's very difficult to say what Nietzsche really meant, especially because he changed his mind during his life. He was very fond of Schopenhauer at some point in the early days. Then he said Schopenhauer was completely wrong, and he blundered everything. He actually writes that Schopenhauer blundered this just like he blundered about anything else. He says that in his weird autobiography, Ecce Homo. So it's very difficult to pin down Nietzsche's meaning, because you have to ask, well, when was he writing? If you're saying that Nietzsche thought this, and when did he think this? Was it in the early days, in the mid-career, or in the late days? And even then, it's difficult to pin down his meaning. Schopenhauer, on the other hand, was consistent. The second edition of The World as Will, or the final edition in his lifetime of The World as Will and Representation, I believe came in 1853. The first edition was in 1818. And guess what? He extended it, but he didn't change a word of the first edition. Mm-hmm. He didn't change a word of what he wrote in his early 30s and late 20s, when he was in his late 60s. So the coherence of his message is not comparable with Nietzsche, because Schopenhauer wrote the same thing over and over again in a multitude of different ways, never really contradicting himself if you have the eyes to read it and not to misinterpret it. So I think we can pin down what Schopenhauer thought, whether he's right or wrong. Yeah. Now, where do I disagree with him? I am not a misogynist to begin with.
Well,
he was a terrible misogynist, censurable misogynist, contemptible misogynist. He was an optimist.
Was Schopenhauer
pessimist.
the one that said the devil's laughter is what's heard after sex?
He was not against sex.
No, it's just that demonstrates the difference between our base desires and our intellect. That
I'm
right
not
after
sure.
copulation, the devil's laughter is heard because it's right then that you're like, what am I doing? Why did I masturbate to that? Like, who am I?
I don't know.
Why am I here?
If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CurtJaimungal.org, CurtJaimungal.org.